Good stuff. Let me go ahead and share my screen, everybody. And sharing PowerPoint. Nice. Cool. Yeah. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining. Again, as Sumia said, this is a small series on some of the best practices of MFTF test writing and everything that entails. Obviously, it's not going to be an exhaustive list of every single possible thing you could do to make it better, but it should be a good starting point for a lot of people. So, without further ado, the first topic that we're going to be covering today is test isolation. It's a contentious topic that a lot of people talk about since it's a kind of a pretty hard requirement for MFDF and it's a pretty hard one to achieve. So I want to demonstrate some of the easiest ways to go about doing that. So just to define it, what is test isolation? Test isolation refers to when a test does not leave data behind or configuration changes in Magento. So that should be pretty self-explanatory what that means. It means deleting products, deleting categories, deleting users, tax rules, whatever entity that you create, or whatever changes you make to the Magento instance, you should try to undo all of them as much as possible before your test is considered done. So a full definition of a test is considered isolated is if it does not leave data behind, doesn't leave Magento configured in a different state than when the test started, doesn't affect the next test's outcome, and it does not rely on regular configurations to start its preconditions. So just diving into some of the more nuanced topics of this list here. Does not leave data behind, pretty obvious. Doesn't leave Magento configured in a different state than when it started, also pretty obvious. Doesn't affect the following test outcome, self-explanatory. However, the last one, it does not rely on an irregular configuration to start its preconditions. That essentially just means that the test or the suite actually makes changes to Magento and then makes sure that the test is ready to run. The reason why that is, why not leave the CI/CD environment to do something like that, is mostly because that's the whole reason why we have suites and stuff like that. So there's built-in methods to achieve that. So why is test isolation important? It's important because poor isolation can lead to other test failures, right? For the test views, we have to have high confidence that it's actually not failing randomly or because of tests before it. And if you introduce a test that has isolation problems, you can invalidate or at least start bringing into question another test's outcome. So for automation to be useful, you need to be able to just fire it off and to not have to worry and scrutinize every single test outcome to make absolutely sure that, did this test actually fail because it failed or did it fail because another test before it did something to the Magento instance that would cause all the tests afterwards to fail, right? And then you have to get into the weeds of looking at test run order, and then you have to start taking a look at the build more closely, and some of those artifacts are not really human readable. And it starts to basically invalidate the whole reason why you have automation in the first place. So the big and difficult portion, how to actually achieve test isolation. The 2 points above, always review the starting state from scratch and ensure that each test cleans up properly after itself, are the overall high-level views of how to do that. And yeah, the former is easier, but for functional tests, rebuilding the database each time can add a lot of time to test cleanup or test run. So the cleanup strategy is much more practical in our case. If you've done automation at all using different frameworks, perhaps for different products, you probably used that strategy of just rebuilding the database every time, or running every test against a fresh environment. But with Magento, the application, that's not really so simple, or rather, we have found that that's not really simple. Doing like a snapshot of what the database looked like and then rebuilding towards it after every single test run starts to become pretty time costly. So, and since tests should be a small slice of functionality and should only be testing specific things about the application, it's kind of overkill to just take the whole application and then reset it to a snapshot when all you need to do is delete a product, or all you need to do is run a bin Magento command to switch from one mode to another, right? You're looking for time effectiveness whenever it comes to automating tests via UI functional stuff, because the UI functional is already kind of heavy, so you want to make small optimizations wherever you can. So one of the cleanup approaches, deleting versus restoring. Some examples of entities that need to be deleted, again, cart or categories, products, rules, like cart price rules, product price rules, related products, cross-sell, users, user roles even, attributes, attribute sets. Basically, whenever you're in a test, whenever you're going to be creating something by hand or like using an action group to create a product or something, in your after, you should absolutely have the delete version of that action group. Entities to be restored store configurations. That's the kind of thing that you need to take a look at what the default state of Magento normally is so that you can restore to what it was. Now, one of the difficulties with this is obviously what are you going to do? Are you going to kill your Magento instance every single time to try to figure out what the store configuration is or what the default set is? Kind of. Sometimes you might have to do that. If your test is really destructive towards the Magento instance, you honestly might just need to take a quick look to see what configurations you changed and what CLI commands you had to run. This is a simple example of some of the easy go-tos for cleaning up data. So if you see that there's a create data in the before, you should have a delete data in the after, right? You can see in this example, the before create data for creating the category. There's a delete category in the after that matches up to it, so you just have a one-to-one relationship. And in this test, there is a create data in the body as well. Then you can see right away that that there is a delete data in the after as well. Yeah, both in test in body and test before. One thing to note as well, whenever you're using this kind of strategy of matching up one-to-one create data to delete data, you may want to delete them in the order that they were created. So what does that mean? Category comes first, was created first technically in this test order, so therefore it gets deleted first. The entity during the workflow was created after that, so it gets deleted after. The reason why you want to do that is in case for some reason your test failed before it got to the create data in the test body, what would happen is the before would go, that first entity would be created, it wouldn't actually hit the test body, and then in the after, it would start to try to delete stuff. And since the latter is not created at all, it would just error out because it wasn't created, and you would have a leftover category from your before. Some more ways to determine whether or not you need to be doing some test cleanup or some cleanup during or after your test. If you might need to understand the workflow. If you see that there's an action group in the middle of it that is going to create a category, it's not a create data, so you can't match it up one-to-one. But if you understand the test flow, it should be pretty obvious, oh, I created a product in my test flow, so I need to delete it. You just need to be mindful of stuff like that. Comments help. Absolutely. If you just create XML comments around general blocks of code, if for some reason they can't be abstracted out to action groups, or maybe they're a part of multiple different action groups, if you just create a human readable comment, in case you forget to clean up, if I were to pick up this test, I would look to see if there's any commenting around it, just like any other piece of code. And then I would say, oh, okay, cool. They're creating a category and they forgot to include something in the after, so I just need to do something there. Cleaning up configs, really similar strategy to the create data, delete data. If you're using the Magento CLI command to change a configuration, you better be doing that in the after as well. And when we're talking about the order of cleaning up, in general, Magento CLI commands, I would say probably should be one of the first things to be cleaned up if possible. It's a really robust command. It's generally speaking never just going to randomly fail, since all it's doing is, performing REST operations against the backend. That kind of stuff is really robust, and you don't need to worry about it failing in the middle of a test or something like that. Obviously, some cases you may need to delete your entities first before you can reset the configuration, but that's another rule of thumb that you may want to keep in mind. So test workflow can also alter the application's configuration, much like a Magento CLI command would be able to, right? When test is specifically testing the configuration page in the UI, you could also bet that you're going to need to be cleaning it up later. You see in this test right here, there's a comment. Again, comments always help. Don't be afraid of putting them in. Enable use categories paths for a URL by going to stores configuration catalog and then so on, right? So that's the stores configuration page, which essentially matches up to the CLI commands. If this is being done in the test, number one, it shouldn't be done in the test. Just use the CLI command. Way more robust, way faster. You're saving time, and then you're saving also test complexity. But number two, if for some reason this is part of an action group or it doesn't have a path for the CLI to map to for some reason, you're going to be needing to do CLI commands afterwards to clean up. Again, comments help 100%. It's so much easier just looking at this and seeing this little chunk than reading this chunk of code and examining, okay, like does this change the configuration? Does this change the configuration? Does this change the configuration? So on. So yeah, those are the general strategies of how to clean up after your test. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, and we have a DevDocs article that more or less has this contents of these tests. Let me just pull it up real quick. That's our goal with most of these best practices. We have a new section in DevDocs. Let me share my screen. New section of DevDocs called test writing, which contains a lot of these articles that we're essentially converting into presentations, so we can talk to you guys about them. This specific one, test isolation, pretty much one-to-one code samples and the stuff that I talked about here. If anybody needs a reference, and again, these are living documents. As we come up with better strategies of test isolation and MFTF enhancements, we will be updating these so that they reflect the best practices of the stuff that we do in-house and the stuff that quality engineering is advocating for when it comes to writing tests. Any questions? Not seeing anything in the chat. Cool then. Should I do another one or not?
Oh, we could.
We could.
Test modularity?
Modularity it is. Okay. So if there's no questions on this first test isolation one, that one is a little straightforward for a lot of people, I feel. Test modularity is the polar opposite of that. Is not very straightforward at all. It's one of the more difficult aspects of MFTF to actually be able to do. Let me just open this in desktop apps so that I can share it with you guys. All right, test modularity then. Let's just dive right into it. What is test modularity when it comes to MFTF? Test material merging is basically two things. There's a test material merging that we've already covered extensively in DevDocs under merging, so I'm not even going to get into that. And it's also something that I'm sure most people who use MFTF understand, internally and externally. But the second point of it is that test materials are modulars themselves. What does that mean? Test materials actually being correctly owned by the right Magento module, and the tests only have references to what their owner Magento module has a dependency on. So, test materials being correctly owned by the right Magento module. An example of this would be if I'm operating, or if I need to create a create category page and create a bunch of elements there, or action groups for create category page, that means that stuff should belong underneath the catalog module. Same thing for, I don't know, if I'm editing tax roles, that's probably going to be the tax module. And that tests only have a reference to what their owner Magento modules has a dependency on. That means that if my test is doing a workflow which requires catalog to be on and requires use of action groups or something like that from catalog, then that probably means that the module where this test lives should have a dependency on catalog. Otherwise, you get into, well, I'll get into it in a little bit. So test ownership example. So this is from admin login test. You can see that the first action group here, login as admin, is referring to this action group. So we're good to go because it's in the same module, right? Backend to backend. Seeing current URL, admin login page.url. You can see that it goes to admin login page, which lives under backend. So this test ownership example is good to go. Another ownership example is between the admin create category test. So we can see one of the first things that it does is it logins the admin. The login as admin action group comes from this file underneath backend. And you can see in the composer.json for catalog module itself, it hard requires Magento module backend. So you should not have any problems there. If catalog is enabled, backend will also therefore have to be enabled. Therefore, this is a safe reference to make. Now this is an example of the same test. I edited it. We don't have this rule violation in our actual code base right now, thankfully. But this catalog test right here, admin create category test, comes from catalog. And there's a reference to this really long-winded add downloadable link information action group, right? So it's for downloadable products. And then you can see that this action group comes from this file underneath downloadable, but catalog compose.json has absolutely no references to module downloadable. Therefore, this right here is breaking test modularity in the sense that if I have catalog enabled, I do not necessarily have downloadable enabled. And since MFDF uses the enabled modules in the Magento instance to determine what to read and what to not read, then that means that this test may fail to generate under specific circumstances if for some reason I disabled downloadable product. So yeah, why is it important? Because it merges based on what it has enabled. Incorrect dependencies will lead to broken tests. And just an example in the previous slide, referencing an action group that is not being merged in. So how can I achieve test modularity? This is very difficult. This is probably one of the most difficult parts of MFDF because it's not particularly straightforward. It requires a lot of thinking, and it requires you to be thinking about dependencies of the modules while you're actually writing the tests themselves. So yeah, so the first approach is intuition. It's not really an approach, but test nomenclature can actually lead to obvious relationships. And I put obvious in quotes because it is intuitive. It's probably going to be right a good percentage of the time, but it is not deterministic. So yeah, if you see a selector that has tax class ID right there, probably belongs to the tax module, probably, but this is an assumption. You will probably need to double check this. So the other approach, instead of being intuitive, you're actually going to be deducing by searching through the Magento or extension code base. Use portions of the element to determine what the ownership is to create correct correlations to portions of code, right? So this is a little top-to-down example. So say I need to be interacting with the add attribute button, right? So this right here is what the add attribute button looks like in the source of the page. And then I see pretty immediately that it actually has an ID just right away. So if I search for ID equals add attribute like this in the code base, it leads me to these 4 files inside Magento. So this one is an MFDF section, don't need to worry about it. This is an MFDF section, don't need to worry about it. This is an MFDF action group, don't need to worry about it. But right here, you see that underneath catalog, view, admin HTML, there's a UI component, product form.xml right here, that it mentions a button specifically by the name of add attribute and gives it the class of edit button add attribute, right? So based on a small search like that, you can pretty much link directly, okay, so this right here should definitely belong underneath catalog. So whenever I create this attribute, and if I'm using it in my test, then my test needs to have some sort of dependency to catalog. Yeah, so before I move on, this is, again, one of the trickiest parts of the framework, but it is something that you can do. You can try to rely on titles, on IDs and stuff like that. Data UI IDs can be somewhat useful as well, but generally ID and title are going to be the unique identifiers that lead you directly to where your test or where the material should actually live. So the last double check that MFDF actually includes is the bin MFDF static checks command. So it basically just does a test material ownership check. It parses through tests, finds all the different references that the test has, and then double checks that the module relationship is at least correct. It's useful for quick feedback, but obviously it's not magic. It's not going to find out exactly where every test material is supposed to live, but it's just going to make sure that at least the test references aren't broken. As of right now, the static check isn't part of our static check build or anything like that. It's not built into CI/CD, mostly because we do have some violations that we need to take care of before we can call this the golden standard that everybody 100% needs to follow. Also, I don't think this static checks command is being used extensively by anybody outside of the occasional spot check from MQE. And I think from implementation, what it's actually doing is it's actually building out the dependency tree in full, meaning that if you have, let's say the module has a dependency to store has a bunch of other dependencies in Magento. So there's like a base set of modules that almost always are part of the dependency tree. I think there was some talks internally whether or not we wanted to build out that full dependency tree or just use explicit naming, right? So if store requires backend and for some reason my module doesn't require backend by name, then it would need to require backend by name for it to pass the static check. But yeah, give this command a shot. And let us know what you guys think. Try to make some direct violations. Obviously, we check to see that it works, and it does work. But the feedback of the static checks is probably going to be the thing that we need the most feedback from you guys on to make sure that it's actually helpful and useful. Because this is, again, something hard to achieve, but it is very important. Any questions offhand for the test modularity portion? Cool. Good stuff. Again, similar to that test isolation, we have this whole test modularity article up with the what, why, and how of how to do this with the exact same example and some of the same stuff and links to other parts of DevDocs. But yeah, if anybody has any questions on any of the two topics that we covered today, feel free to ask them in the MFDF channel. Feel free to ask them in Pangolins or the MQE team. Feel free to honestly ping anybody if you have any questions about it or if something about that was unclear that you guys want to ask in the full meeting setting. We're always more than happy to help you guys achieve the golden standard that we're all shooting for MFDF test writing.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. So if we don't have any questions, we'll wrap things up here. All right. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kevin.